Today we're talking about the Cowboy Cartel. And first of all, I wanted to ask you, how did you learn about the story for the first time?
I actually learned it through my directing partner, Castor. He had directed a movie, documentary called Dark Horses. So he was in the horse world, and as he was finishing that up, one of his contacts there was like, you need to read about this story." And I think that was around 2019. And then, yeah, around early 2021, we'd worked together before. We were longtime friends. He brought me the project.
When did you decide that the case of Los Zetas is something worth depicting and talking about? Was it like a tipping point that that made you feel that this is it, we're going with it?
I think that to me, I mean, the story is so extraordinary. I mean, the
Hmm.
story of Scott Lawson being a rookie FBI agent taking on this cartel in the way that he took it on. Castor and I say, and it was something that's very important to me, that I didn't want to make a story about violence. And typically, when people take on these cartels, it's a very, very violent story. And that violence is horrible and depraved and horribly damaging. And it's also distracting from the inner workings that it's underneath the cartel. So we wanted to tell a story about power and influence, and how you get that power and influence is generally through money. And so it was a really innovative way to tell a crime story from a different entry point. And I think from the get-go, as soon as I heard the story, we were like, this is an incredible story. And it's really then about getting access and doing the research to be able to tell it.
And how did you reach out to Scott Lawson? And what was his approach towards the idea? Like, was he apprehensive? Was he hesitant? Or did you have to, persuade him? Or maybe he was eager to go?
We went through the proper channels. We reached out to the FBI, and they have their system of getting in touch with these folks. And he was very receptive right from the get-go. I think the one thing that Scott always maintained, and we maintained as we made it, was that yes, he is this. He's sort of the hero of the story, but it's a team effort. And he always wanted to make sure that he's a very, very humble guy. He always wanted to make sure that the other people on the team got just as much glory as he did. From Steve Pennington to the IRS task force, to some of the other people that are sort of behind the scenes. But yeah, I mean, we reached out and had a great connection straight away.
Yeah, and you also spoke to other officers and journalists, and how did those people enrich your narrative? And obviously, who were they?
We have Joe Tone, Melissa Del Bosque. They both had written a book about this case. And then Ginger Thompson, who, really for me was just one of the most impressive people I've ever met. And her story ran parallel to Scott's story and the federal investigation story. And she did so much purely on her own. That just as her weapon was the pen. Or the keyboard, as it were. And Melissa has some deep ties to this world. She has some deep knowledge of these two communities that exist, that are separated by this border. And then Joe, they all have done tremendous amounts of research. And so whether it was connections to other people, just the fabric of the story, they added a tremendous amount.
And I don't know if those things only happen on films, but is your documentary kind of revealing any new information that, for instance, came up during your own research? Maybe you only relied purely on everything that happened, and there was no need to look for something more.
We're always looking for new discoveries in storytelling. I think making this documentary in the way that we told it, in this sort of innovative new storytelling, it's not just a straight crime story, true crime story. It really, you discover new perspectives. And that was really our goal, was to get people to look at this subject matter that everybody is aware of, but see it in this entirely new way. Some way, a much bigger, much more global, much more intricate way of looking at organized crime and cartels in a way that is not just so upsetting of just seeing the violence, because the violence is always there and it is always, always awful.
I wanted to ask, because Lawson's investigation, it took down the Trevino brothers, but this is the case. But is this case really closed? I mean, were there like any, I don't know, proverbially life-threatening situation for Lawson or even for you, only because you have decided to go back to the story?
Whenever you're dealing with organized crime, especially of this stature and this kind of power, there's always risk. There is law enforcement officers that gave us their full blessing and their full involvement in the story, but did not want to be named and did not want to be seen because they still live in these communities. Yes, this case is closed. It was brought to conclusion, largest money laundering investigation in Texas history. That was a success. But, these cartels still exist. They'll find new ways, they do new things. So it is an ongoing story, but hopefully this documentary allows you to see it in a slightly different angle. And a little bit more depth.
So you mentioned that Castor Fernandez is your friend, and I know you worked previously on different projects, but how did you discuss the directing and the style of your show? Did you kind of rely on the methods you had, or maybe you try to come up with something brand new?
We are always trying to come up with new methods. I think directing with Castor, we have a real trust, and we are constantly, when we even conceived the show, when we brought it out, we got together in a hotel room and we just talked about ideas, sharing ideas, new techniques, different ways of telling stories, to make it immersive, make it theatrical, make it just really, really dynamic storytelling. So yeah, I think because we've known each other for such a long time, we know our lanes and we know what our strong suits are, and we feed and we challenge each other in those ways.
So I'll give you the follow up to this. And so how does this show differ from other productions you had chance to work on? And I'm not talking about the topic, but I'm talking about the aesthetics and the stylistics, or like how did you handle the narrative differently, maybe?
I think that it was such a great opportunity to tell such a large story in such a difficult way. And the narrative that we had to really push towards was to get you to think about these organizations in different ways. And we did that in terms of spending a lot of time with our interview subjects, the lenses we chose for those interview subjects, the lenses that we chose for the recreation sections. We wanted the recreation to be a real addition to the story. And that was an opportunity that we'd never had on a scale like this before. We're also working with horses. Castor had, but I'd never filmed horses, and it is incredibly difficult. And that was a wonderful challenge and opportunity. But I think I am always aesthetically minded. I'm always looking for ways to tell a different story. I'm always looking for visually to tell a story. Big, wide open spaces to tell our interview stories. We wanted to put them in familiar situations. We wanted to put them in conflicting situations. We're interviewing Steve Pennington in a horse stable. Yes, it's a story about horses, but you don't expect him to be in that sort of wider setting. Joe Tone is in a dive bar. Like, that bar has the connotations of conversation, of talking about horses and that kind of thing. So that was always very, very important to us from the start. And I think working with the folks at Apple TV Plus, they allowed us that world and that leeway to do that.
Because as a documentary filmmaker, and you also mentioned that at least 2 times during our talk, that you work with a lot of people and you're kind of building their trust. You have to know how to reach out to them and then how to talk to them and how to make them feel comfortable with your projects. So what are your own, methods of gaining the trust of the people you collect and work with?
Honesty is the first section. I'm always very upfront with the people that I'm talking to about where we're trying to go, what we're trying to get at. And I think if you're doing that together as a team, you always get to a better destination than if you try and withhold things or try and steer a story in a way that it's not going. We spoke to some people that are very dedicated, some people that are, very smart, very learned in what they're talking about and what they've studied. So we have an idea, we talk about it, and then we see where the story goes. That's you're talking about discovery. But yeah, just honesty. You just got to be honest about what story you're trying to tell. Because if you break that honesty and you go back on that, then that's really bad.